To understand the actions of the Prophet ﷺ and what category of Sunnah the action of the Prophet ﷺ falls into, the ulama have broken it down to six. Now, going into the six is going to be difficult right now, but there are six actions of the Prophet ﷺ. One of them is that he just did a natural action, and there is no Sunnah in regards to that. The way he, perhaps the way he used to walk, perhaps the way he, used to blink. The things that he did naturally, things that he didn't ask anyone to copy him in. Okay. Unless if that walking and that eating, those natural actions and that drinking has something that he told us to follow us in. Okay. And that would become another category in itself. So now you got natural actions, then you got customary actions, the things that he did which were available at that time, and he only did it because of the availability at that time. So he rode a camel. It's not sunnah today for a person to ride a camel. He used to wear what people wear in ihram, the rida and the izar. It's not sunnah for a person to wear that today. So that is a customary action, and that has no sunnah connected to it. Again, on the condition that he didn't encourage it. So now, a customary action is that he wore clothes according to the customs of that time, but he told us, he encouraged us to wear white. So then that in itself would carry a sunnah because of the fact that he encouraged it. Now, the staff, as the ulama have explained when it comes to the actions, he didn't do it as an act of worship, which is another category. He didn't do it to explain the Quran or the Sunnah as a bayan, as the ulama say. So for example, sometimes in the Quran you find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us to do something. For example, Qimus Salah, establish the Salah. The Prophet ﷺ, in his actions, explained to us how to follow that commandment of Allah from the Quran. So he said, Sallu kama ra'aytumuni usalli. Pray as you have seen me pray. So that becomes a category in itself, that he's done an action which is to explain something from the religion. Another action which is an act of worship, which is not an explanation, but it's an act of worship that the Sunnah has come to teach us. And there are many of those. So for example, you will not find miswak in the Quran, but the Prophet ﷺ showed us how to perform the miswak. Perhaps this is not an act of worship in and of itself. Perhaps this is a customary action which then becomes an act of legislation, a recommended action, and then it would fall under that category. Again, with the white clothes, it's a customary action, but it's not mentioned in the Quran. But the fact that the Prophet ﷺ told us to do it becomes a branch in itself that the Prophet ﷺ told us to do, not as an explanation, but as an act of legislation. But an act of worship, let's say, for example, which is not found in the Quran, fasting Mondays and Thursdays, for example, or fasting, the Ayyam al-Bid, for example. You don't find any kind of reference to that in the Quran, but the Prophet ﷺ legislated it through his Sunnah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Therefore, that becomes an act, a category from the actions of the Prophet ﷺ. Now, the question here is the staff. The Prophet ﷺ used to have a stick. Is that something which is from category 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6? 6, let me just briefly mention what 6 is. 6 is where they are differed, the scholars are differed. Is it sunnah? Is it not sunnah? Is it customary? Is it not? And then so that's where you find a lot of difference of opinion from the madhahib, from outside the madhahib. And there is an approach which basically says, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. The default is, if he did it, we follow him. So if he had long hair, we follow him. If he put oil in his hair, we follow him. If he had a staff, we follow him. If he wore a ring, we follow him. But then there's another group of scholars who say, no, this ayah here, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ, is an example that he has left for us to follow. That's what the ayah basically means. In Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this is the best example. So the example that he has left behind for us are those things which are clear and evident in his sunnah. Therefore, the second view from the ulama is that, look, he had long hair because that's what was customary at that time. Men at that time used to have long hair. And if you look throughout the ages, Islamically, there were periods in time where men didn't have long hair anymore. And they didn't apply um, oil to their beard or to their hair anymore. Things changed. So that's the sixth category. So now the staff, what seems to be the correct view is that it was a customary action, meaning at that time, just like we have now, customary, if you get to a certain age, you need support, you take a walking stick. And this is precisely what he did, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Some of the ulama say, the staff is from the Sunnah, but is applied to the Jumu'ah khutbah, or any other khutbah for that matter. And you will find this in the madhabs of the Hanafis and Hanbalis, etc., which is that they've said that the Prophet ﷺ used to have something that he used to lean against. So initially he used to have the palm tree. In the hadith of Jabir, the palm tree began to weep. You know the story when they made a minbar, etc., and then the Prophet ﷺ put his hands on the tree and it calmed it down. The point here is that the Prophet ﷺ always had something to solidify his standing. So even when the minbar was made, he had something to solidify his standing. And this is why we find in the madhabs they say that it is makruh for the imam to keep turning right and left and himself fidgeting in the khutbah. If the ma'mumin, the people who are listening, are not allowed to fidget, then the imam shouldn't fidget either. He shouldn't look right, he shouldn't look left, should just look straight. He shouldn't be bothered about making eye contact or making bodily gestures with his hands, etc. All of that is not befitting for the khutbah. This is a view from the scholars, that he stands straight as he can and delivers the khutbah, projecting his voice as loud as he can, and he does that without fidgeting and without moving. Makruh al-iltifat, as they have said, it's makruh for him to move around and perhaps fidget. So this is the view from some of the ulama, that the reason why he had a stick was to keep him firm during the Jumu'ah khutbah. As for general times, as you will find, from the time in his time in Mecca, he didn't have a stick. And this is what seems to be evident from his sunnah, that he didn't have it. Had it been something which was really important and an act of sunnah in itself, then he would have had it from the beginning. But what seems to be the case is that he used to use it to lean, and he used to use it in a customary way. Now here, this falls into the sixth category again, because like I said, some of the scholars will say, no, he is an example for you, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If you had a stick, we're going to have a stick. And if that is an interpretation which is legitimate, then it has to be respected. But just like any differences of opinion from the ulama, you have to follow what you think is stronger, which is more evident, which is closer to the truth, in line of the evidence. And if you look at the time of the companions, after the passing of the Prophet ﷺ, nobody took a stick as an act of sunnah. Nobody started walking around a stick. You didn't find young men like Ibn Umar and Ibn Abbas, may Allah be pleased with them all, walking around with a stick to say, oh well, this is the sunnah. No, the fact that the Prophet ﷺ had a stick kind of supports the argument that he did it because of because of his old age. As Aisha radiallahu anha also mentions, that the Prophet ﷺ used to sit before he used to get up. After the sajda, he used to make a jalsatul istirah. Perhaps you've seen people do this. Because after they get up from the sajda, they sit briefly and then they stand up. This is well known from the Shafi'i madhab. And again, this is just an example of how the Prophet ﷺ adopted something later on in his life because of his, elderly of age. He's in his 60s, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So having a stick and a staff, that explains that. As for Surah Sajda before going to sleep, now see, like the question is asking here, which is a very intelligent question, do we just do it because he did it, even though there isn't any specific virtue or any particular hikmah involved? Then this here, the Prophet ﷺ is reciting Quran before he goes to sleep. Is that normal? Is that a natural action? Is that a customary action? Is that an action of bayan from the Quran? Is that an action that he's legislated in his sunnah? Or is it an action where the scholars have differed? This clearly tells us here now that this is an action that he did as part of his sunnah, and we follow him in it. And I know this has been lengthy, but just to highlight a very important point, sometimes people will only accept something from the Quran or from the sunnah or from both if they can understand the virtue and the reason behind it. And this is completely and categorically incorrect. The believers have been said, as you find in Surah Nur, when they are being called to do something, they say, we hear and we obey. And you will never find, as Ibn Taymiyyah and others have said, never find from the time of the companions that when a sunnah came to them, they said, oh, is it wajib? Is it mustahab? Is it something that we must do? Is it mubah? No, as soon as it came to them, they followed it. So this is important as a point in itself, that these categories exist for us to understand, to help us deduce, to help us categorize the actions so that we can put a hukm and an understanding of the religion connected to the actions and the statements of the Prophet ﷺ. But once they fall into a category of us understanding that this is something which is legislated, we must comply to the best of our ability, and that is part of us following the Messenger of Allah ﷺ. وَمَن يُطِعِ الرَّسُولَ فَقَدْ أَطَاعَ اللَّهَ. Whoever follows the Messenger of Allah, then surely he has followed what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told him to do. Hopefully this has gone in some way in explaining it. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enrich us with the Sunnah and allow us to follow it to the best of our ability. هذا والله أعلم. صلى الله على نبينا محمد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.